The day the widow rode into Red Willow Gulch, the wind was already arguing with the earth, pushing dust like it had a grudge. Caleb Harlan saw her before the town did, because he was mending a fence line just east of the creek, sweat darkening his hatband. Hope a thing he had packed away with his dead wife's shawl. She came on a grey mare, straight-backed, eyes steady, and the boy at her side on a smaller horse clutched a book to his chest like it was a canteen in the desert. Caleb felt something tightened and loosened, like a not remembering how to be rope again. Folks would later say the widow brought change with her, but Caleb knew right then the change had already started, because his son Jonah looked up from the dirt and stared as if the world had just learned a new word. Red Willow Gulch had a way of swallowing people whole. The land did not care for names or plans, it cared for work, and Caleb had given it plenty since Martha died. He kept 2 routines because routines did not ask questions. Sunrise meant coffee, fence, cattle. Sundown meant stew and silence. Jonah followed him like a shadow, bright and curious, asking questions that drifted unanswered into the rafters. The boy was 9 and knew how to ride, shoot tin cans, and sleep through storms, but letters were a mystery. They sat on the page like ants that would not line up. Caleb told himself there would be time, when the herd was sold, when winter eased, when grief learned to sit quiet. The widow's name was Eliza Moore. She said it to the shopkeeper first, voice calm, like she was used to rooms listening. She wore black that had softened with miles, not the stiff mourning of town women. Her hands bore ink stains and calluses both. She asked for a room, asked for chalk, asked for where a person might find children who needed learning. The shopkeeper blinked and pointed toward the schoolhouse that had not held a teacher in 2 years. When Eliza stepped back outside, Jonah was there, peering. She smiled at him like she had been waiting all day. He clutched his book tighter. Caleb felt a heat rise in his chest, protective, puzzled, hopeful in a way that felt dangerous that evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills. Eliza knocked on Caleb's door. No hesitation, no flutter. She held the boy's book out like an offering. Said Jonah had told her he wanted to read the sky and the maps and the notes his mother left behind. Caleb swallowed. The room smelled of beans and wood smoke. He had not expected this knock, had not prepared an answer. Eliza spoke gently but straight. Said she could teach Jonah if Caleb agreed. Said she could start tomorrow. Said she asked no charity, only a fair trade. Perhaps a meal now and then, perhaps a place to set a table in the old schoolhouse. Caleb looked at Jonah, saw his son's eyes burning brighter than any lamp, and he nodded before fear could catch up. The first lesson happened under a cottonwood, because the schoolhouse door stuck and the light was better outside. Eliza drew letters in the dirt with a stick, slow and patient. Jonah traced them like he was learning a trail. A like a tent, B like a saddle with 2 curves. The boy laughed when it worked, a sound Caleb had not heard since before the fever. Eliza noticed Caleb watching and invited him closer. Said letters were for everyone, not just the young. He shook his head. Said his hands were better with rope. She smiled and said rope was a kind of language too. But letters could tie time together. Caleb felt foolish and warm, like a man standing near a fire he did not yet trust. Days found a new shape. Mornings still brought work, but afternoons held chalk dust and quiet triumphs. Jonah learned to sound words, slow at first, then quicker. His pride showed in the way he squared his shoulders. Eliza praised effort more than speed. She spoke of patience like it was a muscle. Caleb listened from the fence, from the doorway, from the edge of a life he had sealed shut. He learned Eliza had lost a husband to a river that took without asking. Learned she had taught in towns that dried up. Learned she stayed because children were roots, and roots kept places alive. At night, Caleb dreamed of letters marching across the dark, forming words he could almost touch. Trouble came soft, as it often did, in the form of whispers at the saloon. Some said the widow was stirring things. Some said a boy needed work, not books. Caleb heard and said nothing, but his jaw set. When a ranch hand laughed at Jonah's reading, Caleb stepped in, voice low, said knowledge did not break a man, it mended him. The hand backed off, surprised. Caleb surprised himself too. Eliza met his eyes later, gratitude and something else passing between them, like 2 riders acknowledging the same storm cloud on the 7th day. Jonah read a note Martha had written years ago. Folded and worn, his voice shook, then steadied. Caleb felt his chest crack open. Grief poured through but did not drown him. Eliza stood nearby, not intruding, just present. When Jonah finished, he looked up and smiled. Caleb realized hope was not a loud thing. It arrived like dawn, patient, inevitable, teaching a man how to see again. Autumn leaned into Red Willow Gulch like an old friend with heavy stories. Mornings carried frost that cracked under boots, and afternoons glowed the color of brass. Jonah's lessons moved indoors as the schoolhouse door finally gave way to patience and oil. Eliza set the table straight, chalk lined like soldiers, books stacked with care, and the room filled again with purpose. Caleb began staying, first leaning against the wall, then sitting near the back, telling himself he was there to keep Jonah company. But the truth was quieter and stronger. The sound of letters forming words felt like rain on dry ground, and each sentence Jonah read stitched something shut inside Caleb that grief had left torn open. Eliza noticed the way Caleb's eyes followed the chalk, the way his hands twitched when Jonah struggled with a word. One afternoon she slid a slate across the table toward him. He said nothing, just waited. The silence was kind, not pressing. Caleb stared at the blank space like it might bite, then drew a crooked C, laughed once under his breath, embarrassed. Eliza said learning was not a race, it was a return, and that line settled in him deeper than he expected. Nights after that, he practiced by lamplight, sounding out labels on jars, names in ledgers, the world slowly giving up its secrets. Not everyone welcomed the change. The saloon grew louder with opinions as winter threatened. Men said books would not feed cattle, that a widow with chalk was no match for hard seasons. When the schoolhouse window broke, Caleb fixed it himself. When chalk went missing, he bought more. His defense was quiet but unyielding. Eliza did not ask him to fight her battles, but she noticed the way he stood closer, the way his voice carried steadier when he spoke. Trust grew between them like grass through stone. Unnoticed until it was everywhere, Jonah's confidence bloomed fast. He read notices aloud in town, helped neighbors write letters to distant kin. Pride settled on him like a well-worn coat. One evening he asked about his mother's favorite book. Caleb had not known the answer. Shame pricked him. Eliza found the book at a trader's stall, read it aloud by firelight. Jonah listened with his head on Caleb's knee. The words painted worlds that felt possible. Caleb watched the flames and understood that stories did more than entertain. They carried people through the dark winter, pressed hard, snow-sealing roads, cattle huddled, tempers shortened. The schoolhouse became a refuge. Lessons continued by lantern. Eliza's breath fogged the air as she spoke. Caleb brought extra wood, extra blankets. The three of them formed a small circle against the cold. During a storm that rattled the walls, Caleb confessed his fear of failing Jonah. Eliza listened, said fear was proof of love, and love was a sturdy teacher. The storm passed, leaving the world hushed and bright. When sickness swept a nearby ranch, Eliza organized help. Jonah read instructions aloud. Caleb rode supplies through drifts. The town watched and learned. Respect shifted like the wind. The widow was no longer just a teacher, she was a pillar, and Caleb stood beside her without thinking. Their partnership felt natural, earned. One night, as stars burned sharp, Caleb thanked her for giving Jonah a future. Eliza replied that Jonah had given them both a present. The truth of that settled between them, warm as shared coffee. Caleb's reading grew steady. He wrote his name with confidence, read contracts without dread. The power of it changed how he carried himself. He spoke at town meetings, argued for keeping the school open. His words held weight. Eliza watched him claim this new ground with a smile that carried pride and caution. She knew hope could be fragile, but she also knew it was stronger when shared. Jonah sensed the shift too. His laughter rang out more often. The house filled with sound again as winter broke. The river thawed and ran loud. Caleb walked with Eliza along its edge, spoke of the past without flinching, spoke of the future without apology. They did not name what grew between them. Naming felt unnecessary. Hope was teaching him patience, teaching him to stay present, and for the first time since loss had carved him hollow, Caleb believed that staying was not the same as standing still. Spring arrived like a letter carried by warm wind, unfolding slowly across Red Willow Gulch, green pushing through brown, water loosening the land's old arguments. Jonah read the change aloud wherever he saw it. Cloud shapes, seed sacks, notices nailed to posts. His voice had grown sure, and Caleb felt pride settle deep and steady. The schoolhouse opened its windows wide. Eliza let light flood the room. Lessons turned outward, measuring fields, reading weather signs, writing names of birds that returned after long absence. The town gathered closer to learning than it ever had, and Caleb realized the place itself was changing. Like a man who finally believed he deserved more than survival, trouble tested them again, as it always did when hope got comfortable. A distant speculator rode in, talking of closing the school, selling land, saying education was a luxury the valley could not afford. Words sharpened, tempers flared. Caleb stood and spoke, his voice carrying across the room. He read from records, from letters Jonah had helped him understand. He argued for roots and futures, for children who could choose their paths. Eliza watched him claim the space, eyes bright. When the vote came, the school stayed. The speculator rode out empty-handed, and the town breathed easier, knowing it had chosen itself. Jonah asked for a book of his own, not borrowed, not worn thin by others. Caleb saved and bought it. The boy held it like a promise, reading by fence posts, by creek banks, by firelight. One night he asked Eliza to teach him to write stories. She said stories came from listening first. Jonah listened to the land, to old men, to silence. His first story was about a cowboy who learned to read the sky and his own heart. Caleb laughed and wiped his eyes, understanding that the boy was writing them all forward. Caleb and Eliza found their steps matching without trying. Shared work and quiet, shared laughter that surprised them both. The past still spoke, but softer now. Eliza told him of the river that took her husband, of the fear that followed her like a shadow. Caleb spoke of Martha, of the nights that felt endless. They did not compete with grief. They honored it, letting it sit among them like an old friend who no longer ruled the room. Hope had taught them that love could be patient, wide enough to hold what came before summer brought gatherings under open sky. Jonah read aloud to children and grown folk alike. The schoolhouse spilled into the yard. Eliza guided gently, letting the town claim ownership of learning. Caleb built shelves, repaired desks, fixed the roof. His hands still knew work, but his mind had joined them. He wrote letters to suppliers, planned seasons ahead. The ranch prospered not because the land changed, but because he did, and that knowledge grounded him more firmly than any fence post. When a young mother asked Eliza to stay for good, to make Red Willow her home, Eliza looked to Caleb and Jonah, not for permission, but for truth. Jonah smiled like the answer was obvious. Caleb spoke from a place that felt earned, said the valley needed her, said he needed her, not as a rescue, but as a partner. Eliza took her time, then said yes. The word carried weight and light, like a door opening on a morning worth waking for. Jonah learned to read contracts and poems, to write letters and lists, but more than that, he learned that care made knowledge bloom. He watched adults choose patience over fear. He learned that men could change, that women could lead. That hope was an action, not a wish. Caleb saw his son becoming a man who would not be limited by silence, and gratitude filled him so fully it felt like peace on a clear evening. Caleb sat at the table and wrote, by his own hand, the words steady, deliberate. He wrote of land and seasons, of a widow who taught his son to read and taught him to hope again. Eliza read over his shoulder. Jonah leaned close. The future felt present, solid as wood beneath their palms, and as the sun settled gentle over Red Willow Gulch, Caleb knew that some stories did not end. They simply kept being written, one careful line at a time.